All right. Well, I'm just going to be honest. I don't know if this is a new sermon series or if this is just today's message. So, just putting that disclaimer out there. But, we spent the last 4 weeks talking about Jesus is coming back, and the Lord directed my attention to a passage in the Psalms. And so today's message is simply called A Thousand Hills. And we're going to read that passage in a minute. If you have a Bible or Bible device, you can go ahead and flip open to Psalms, and then we're going to look at a couple of New Testament passages as well. But I want you to think with me. So I looked this up just because I was interested. The average cattle ranch in the U.S. is about 400 and some odd acres. Now that's average, so there are some larger. But if any of you, now most of us here probably didn't grow up in a ranch, but if you maybe at least grew up on a farm. I grew up on a small 40-acre farm in southern Illinois. And I know, even for our little 40-acre plot, like what it takes to look over that, to cultivate it, to plant, to farm, to do the things that a farm does. But we're talking 10 times that size. So just try to imagine, working cattle on that. It's not a one-person job, right? It's a pretty big job. There is still a limit as to like what one person could do. I'm just trying to paint a picture here. Because when we go into this passage, for some of you, this verse is going to be really familiar, where it talks about God owns the cattle on 1,000 hills. Well, I just want to start with this natural picture, and I'm going to go ahead and even reference one of the points that we're going to look at in a few minutes. That like, when it says that God owns the cattle on 1,000 hills, he's not naming a number. He's not saying like, this is God's territory, these 1,000 hills, this is where he lives. He's referencing the fact that it's far beyond. You could say that it means everything, but the point is, it's beyond our capacity. Like, it's beyond what to farm 1,000 hills. Like, I probably can't do that. It's big work to farm even a modest size ranch, right? And so he's saying, I've got way more than that. All right, I don't want to give too much away because we want to go and actually dig into the passage and read it. And we're going to go through a whole chunk here of Psalms 50. But I just want to go ahead and plant that seed for you. Let's start in verse 7. So if you're going to read along, and these will be on the screen for you, I'm going to be reading from the New Living Translation. And starting in verse 7, so there's basically the first 6 verses, and then there's an interlude. And here, the prophet is speaking on God's behalf, and he says, "O my people, listen as I speak. Here are my charges against you, O Israel." Now, I find this really interesting. He says, "These are my charges against you," and then what is the first thing he says? "I am God, your God." The first thing he does is establish relationship. Now, that doesn't sound like a charge to me, but that's the basis on which he's speaking to his people. And then he goes on in verse 8, "I have no complaint about your sacrifices or the burnt offerings you constantly offer. But I do not need the bulls from your barns or the goats from your pens. For all the animals of the forest are mine, and I own the cattle on 1,000 hills." Now, let's go back and just pick up a couple of quick things. First of all, he says, I have no complaint about, if I can rephrase this, he's saying, I have no complaint about you following the ceremonial laws. He's basically saying, you're doing a good job of providing the sacrifices that the law requires. He says, you're offering them constantly. So he says, I don't have that against you. But what is he beginning to say here? He says, you're following the rules, but I don't need what you're bringing me. Now, I don't know about you, but like at first glance, I'm like, well, this doesn't really make sense, God. Why are you saying, we're doing a good job. I don't have a problem with the sacrifices, but I don't need that. But doesn't your law say, okay? And he says, why? Because all of the animals of the forest are his. He owns the cattle on 1,000 hills, and he goes on to talk about how he knows every bird in the mountains, all the animals of the field. And I didn't put this up on the screen, but I do want to touch this. He says in verse 12, if I were hungry, I would not tell you, for all the world is mine and everything in it. You see, part of what God is trying to say is that he is totally self-sufficient. He doesn't ask for a sacrifice because he needs the bull or the goat in the old system. Just like today, he doesn't ask for anything from you because he needs that thing because he's running a little short. What he's saying is, I'm about the heart. He's saying to them, yes, you're following the law, but if you're just doing the sacrifice to check the box, you're not bringing me what I need. And we're going to begin to look here, but I want to start by focusing on this concept that we already touched on. Our capacity is limited, right? So again, if we're thinking in terms of what God has available to him, and we're not going to go back and read, but we could reference the story of Moses and his empire, if you will, and you could apply it to a modern context. He had created wealth. Like for those of us that are here, if you have a job, a vocation, you do something with your life and with your skills that creates income, and you have. Now, I'm not talking about wealth in terms of being rich, but I'm just saying like in terms of money and possessions and things you have. And the concept of created wealth is not a bad thing, right? But what I'm saying is our capacity for created wealth is limited. Right? We there's a spectrum, but it is limited. God's capacity is unlimited. Because this is what he's saying when he says, I own the cattle of 1,000 hills. See, that's God's created wealth because he created the cows and he created the hills and the earthworms that are underneath the hill. Like he created it all. He's like, I don't need you to give me something that I already have. Because God's capacity it's infinite. It's unlimited. And we need to keep that perspective. Now, here's the second implication of that statement. What God creates, he takes care of. What God creates, he takes care of. Now, I don't have to spell this out real far to say that includes us. We are part of God's creation, and he takes care of us. And that's what he's saying to the Israelites. He says, these sacrifices that you're bringing me, it all came from me in the first place. I created all things. All things were good and pleasing in God's sight. I created them and I gave them to you. How many of you recognize that everything you have is a gift from God? He has given you everything, even created wealth, because he gave you the ability to have the mind and the skills and the necessary things to do that job, to create that wealth. And so we recognize that all things are created by God, and he takes care of what he creates. So again, if we're digging into this, if you would go back and do a word study, you would find that the word 1,000 in the biblical text often doesn't mean a number in the sense of it's numbering something 1,000 as a number. In many other contexts, it might refer to an age, a period of time, something new, a new season. And again, here I think he's saying it's like God is trying to say to the Israelites, it's more than you can do, but it's not more than I can do, is what God says. It's more than you can do, but not more than I can do. Because he says, I created it all to begin with. I want to read this quote, and we're not going to go real deep into this because I don't. This is not a theology class, but I think this is important. Matthew Henry is one of the more famous late 17th, early 18th century commentators. And he wrote a commentary on the entire Bible. And he has this statement, and I'm just saying he's conservative in the sense that he wouldn't necessarily agree with our kingdom lens. But even the most conservative groups would recognize him, if I could say it this way, he's solid. Like in evangelical circles. But I found this statement so interesting. He's talking about the intention or the context of Psalms 50. And one of his points is that the psalm is intended as a prediction of the abolishing of the ceremonial law and the introducing of a spiritual way of worship in and by the kingdom of the Messiah. And at that point, it would have been the coming Messiah, because, that's where we're at in the timeline. But he's saying this is pointing to something. As we often know, if you study the major and minor prophets in the Old Testament, that's often the case, because, the Jewish believers were looking forward to a time when a Messiah would come and bring his kingdom rule, right? We know we're now looking back because we're on the other side of the cross. But he says this is pointing to the abolishing of the ceremonial law. See, God's already got that message in there when he's speaking this to them about the issues of the heart. Because we know, as we're going to read here in a moment, God is looking for worshipers who will worship him in spirit and in truth. And so even back here in Asaph's psalm, he's pointing to the fact that with the coming Messiah comes the abolishing of ceremonial law and the coming of true spiritual worship. So what is God communicating to the Israelites, and how can we apply that to our context? Well, I think inherent in this statement that God is making is that he's asking the Israelites, and in our context, us, to partner with him. Which it could be phrased, he's inviting us into relationship. He's inviting us into working with him. Okay, now we're going to jump to the New Testament, because we said we're pointing that. So let's reference a couple of New Testament stories and begin to unpack this. And then we'll make it hopefully really practical. At the end. Go to Matthew 22, and then we're also going to look at John 4 in a minute, but let's go to Matthew 22 for now. Now, I'm not going to read the whole story, but in Matthew 22:17, there's this conversation going on about taxes. And in verse 17, they say to Jesus, "Now tell us what you think about this. Is it right to pay taxes to Caesar or not?" But Jesus, as he's so good at this, he knew their evil motives. Because again, he sees the heart, right? So he knew the intent and motive of their heart. And he replies, "You hypocrites," he said, "why are you trying to trap me?" And we know from knowing the story, like, this is what they were about. The religious leaders of the day were so focused on the religious law, and they were trying to weaponize it, use it to trap Jesus. And he calls them out on that. And then he says, "Okay, here, show me the coin used for the tax." And when they handed him a Roman coin, he asked whose picture and title are stamped on it. Well, Caesar's. I mean, they had no other answer. That was, Well, then, he said, "Give to Caesar what belongs to Caesar, and give to God what belongs to God." And I love, he says, his reply amazed them, and they went away. It's amazing somehow when truth is presented, often the enemy flees. And Jesus, rather than falling into their trap and getting into an argument about something to the side, he went to the heart of the issue and he spoke truth to it. Now, just as an aside here, we need to be asking for the Spirit to give us the ability to do that. There are situations that you're going to deal with this week where you can get caught up and trapped in surface level, or you can, by the help of the Spirit, get to the heart of the issue and speak truth. I want us to become truth speakers. People that can speak hope and life and joy and truth into dark situations, because that's the only thing that's going to shift some of the situations that we deal with. All right, so Jesus says, "Give to Caesar what is Caesar's, give to God what is God's." Well, again, he's pointing to something. He's referencing something. Let's go ahead and flip over to John 4. John 4, verse 21. This is a conversation that Jesus is having with a Samaritan woman. But we're going to drop all the way down. So they've been having this conversation, and if you know the story, basically Jesus again has skillfully called her out because she's talked about her life struggles, if you will, and And at one point, Jesus says to her, "Go get your husband." And she says, "I don't have one." And Jesus says, "You're right. You've had five, and you're not married to the man you're living with now. Certainly you spoke the truth." Again, like he's called out information that he couldn't have known except by the Spirit of God. And that begins to pierce her heart and get to the heart of the issue. And as she's trying to figure out, well, who are you? Jesus replies in verse 21, "Believe me, dear woman, the time is coming when it will no longer matter whether you worship the Father on this mountain or in Jerusalem. You Samaritans," he says, "know very little about the one you worship, while we Jews know all about him, for salvation comes through the Jews. But the time is coming, and indeed it's here now, when true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and in truth. The Father is looking for those who will worship him that way. For God is spirit, so those who worship him must worship in spirit and in truth." See, even in the Matthew passage, this is what Jesus is pointing to. He's saying, what I want is the affection of your heart. What I want now, and I don't, when I say he wants your worship, I'm not talking about the act of just giving voice to something. I'm talking about the heart behind it. You've sometimes heard me say in a moment where maybe we're just being still and waiting on to say, let's just turn our affections towards him. See, because it's not about what's on the outside. Now, we need to have outward expressions. I'm not questioning that. But outward expressions are only valid if the affection of your heart is attuned in that direction. You see, the thing that all of these passages are pointing at, and this one more specifically, is that God is not satisfied with ceremonial, or I could say transactional worship. That's what had happened in the Old Testament system, was that the religious leaders had become really good, and the Israelites that we read in Psalms 50, they had become really good at completing the transactions that were part of their worship, at doing the ceremonial sacrifices and following them to the T of the law, but their hearts weren't in it. You see, rather than ceremonial or transactional worship, God is seeking spiritual or relational worship. See, again, God created all things, so he doesn't need part of his creation, who is us, to come and just like tell him nice things about himself, or to put some money in the offering bucket so that he has enough. Or like, he doesn't need any of those things. What he's seeking is our hearts. He wants a relationship. Now, I don't know if we get that, because we often think about our relationship with God. God wants a relationship with you. It goes beyond, he's God up there and I know about him. He wants you to know him, and he wants to know you. Now, we know that he created us. So, the scripture tells us he knows every hair on our head, every freckle on our nose, but he wants the affection of your heart. He wants to capture that. He wants to have a relationship with you. And this is where worship comes from. As we have a realization of how good God actually is, as we realize that despite my shortcomings and my flaws and my mess ups, that he's still seeking me, he's still pursuing me, it evokes worship. I begin to recognize fully, I don't deserve this relationship. How many of you have used that phrase? Yeah, I married up. Well, I'm one of those, right? Like, I feel like I went out of my, oh yeah, she's giving me glares now. But honestly, like, that's what this relationship with God, we didn't show up to a relationship with God and say, God, aren't you glad you got me? Like, aren't you lucky you got to have me? No, we showed up like, I got nothing. I don't deserve this or the privileges that come with it. And God says, I want you anyway. I created you and I know what you're worth. Because see, God When God looks at you, he doesn't see you in the state that you are. He sees you the way he created you to be. And you and I are still in the process of being transformed and redeemed back into what God created us to be in the first place. You see, as part of our creation, we can look at all of our flaws and our mistakes and our emotional wounds and all the problems we're dealing with in life. Well, that's just how we are. That's just the human condition. That wasn't the way the Creator made us. We were made in the image of God, perfect, blameless, holy, and without flaw. Now, I'm not saying that's what I represent today, but I'm saying that's the creation. God was totally satisfied. He said it was good. And God doesn't use that term loosely. He was satisfied. He was pleased. He looks at you and says, they're the apple of my eye, my prized creation, my masterpiece. And the reality of the gospel of the kingdom of Jesus is that we are in a process of being transformed back more fully into that image. And so when God looks at you, now this can get a little bit, I can't teach you quantum physics, right? So like, I'm probably opening a can of worms. It's like, God operates outside of space and time. Now, I can't explain that to you. I can't quote the theories, but I believe that's a reality. God operates outside of the constraints of space and time that we live in. And so it's possible for God to look at you and see you where you're going to be, and to value you for where you're going to be, to see you with having already realized your created potential. And the process that he has you in is one of teaching you how to step up into that identity and that reality. He's teaching us, he's training us, he's transforming us from what we were, because I'll be honest, and many of you could probably say amen, but I don't want you to do it out loud. I sometimes fall into the trap of more identifying with the me that has already been crucified than the one that's been raised. I try to go get that dead body and put it back on because it feels like this is what I deserve. It feels like this is who I am. And Jesus says, treat it as if it's dead. Live your life as if the reality of the risen Jesus in you is reality. Now, I can't do that on my own, but I am in a process of daily crying out to God and inviting him to continue that process of changing me, of transforming me, of making me more like him. And the result of that, amongst many other things, is that we will have a relationship of loving worship and intimacy with God. All right. Let's begin to bring this into practical terms. In all of this process and these things that we're talking about, God is inviting us, both on individual levels and corporate levels, to partner with him. I mentioned that once already. But that's what God is inviting us into as it relates to you personally. You, like me, probably say, I don't know if I can do it. I don't know if I can get there. I don't know if I can be as much like Jesus as Jesus wants me to be, right? He's not asking you to do it. He's inviting you to partner with him. It's God's work. And if God's the one creating you into new creation, what did we say earlier? God takes care of what he creates. And another way you could put it is that God resources what he asks you to do. I so appreciated this. This is just a nice practical example. On the national level, Vineyard has, over the last 2 years, has gone through a structural reorganization process with our national office. We have a whole new team, and we have some updated structures, and I've really been so grateful for the work that team has done and the way that they're moving us forward. But, one of the things they said to us at the local pastor level as we've gone through some of these things, they said, we're not going to ask you to do something that we're not going to fully resource you and give you the tools to come alongside you and help you do it. Well, I so appreciated that because it's in a movement that's not super institutional, and it has been a group of pioneers and people of the Spirit kind of out on the cutting edge at times. That sometimes is missing, right? It's like we just go with the Spirit and we go and we just do it with God. But that's the way God is. He says, I'm not asking you to transform yourself. I'm inviting you to partner with me because I have the resources to do it. I have the ability. All right? So God is inviting us to partner with him. Now, I've paraphrased this because the language was a little archaic, but this is a nearly direct quote also from that same Matthew Henry commentary. And he talks about the fact that in this reality, we can expect God to speak to us. We can expect that. That comes with the relationship. Now, you're not all in this room or online, you're not all married, but if you have any kind of relationship with any other human being, does that relationship do well if you don't speak to each other? No, it doesn't. Communication is probably one of the biggest challenges in any relationship. And while I've been as guilty of this as anybody else, I heard this great tip when I was in a communications class. The biggest problem with communication is the assumption that it's already happened. The biggest problem with any communication is the assumption that it's already happened. In other words, oh, they already got it. I mentioned that, sometimes we have to over communicate. Sometimes we have to touch something 3 or 4 times, right? With God, we can expect him to speak to us. So where's the problem come? We need to be ready to hear what he's saying. See, a key part of communication is not just what comes out of my mouth and goes to you, it's how you receive it and interpret it. So the problem with us hearing God's heart and understanding what he wants us to do and partnering with him is not on the end of, well, God just needs to speak more. No, we need to be more ready to hear what he's saying. And it's implied that in hearing what he's saying, we have to do it. The Bible says, not hearers only, but doers of the word. All right? But I just felt so caught up by the idea that we need to develop an expectancy that God is speaking. We can expect that with complete confidence. All right? Excuse me. God is inviting us into a new season. I'm just speaking to you as our local church body. God is inviting us into a new season. And God doesn't invite us into things that he doesn't prepare us for, lead us in, and resource us for. But the key is we need to be prepared to hear what he's saying. And so we're going to end our message time here this morning with just another time of prayer. And the specific focus is that I want us to begin to actively pray, and I've worded this very specifically, for our ministry into the community. I want us to pray for our ministry into the community. Now, why, what is so significant about that wording? Well, it's really easy to say, and we have great opportunities to serve here on Sunday morning, and that is valid ministry. I love our volunteers. If you're not part of a volunteer team, I would love to get you connected with ways to serve, because it takes a village, even in a small church. It takes a village to do what happens every week. It's like something about Sundays. They seem to come about every 7 days. And so there's plenty of opportunity. But we need to be careful to not allow facilitating the Sunday morning gathering be the extent of what it means to do ministry. Ministry, as I have previously defined it, is meeting people's needs with God's resources. And there is no shortage of needs in the community. There's no shortage, I will tell you. As a matter of fact, it's so prevalent, it's probably well beyond, we could completely reorganize and dedicate every resource we have to meeting needs in the community, and we would still fall short. So, what's the only option? We need to partner with God. We need to partner with the one who owns the cattle on 1,000 hills and the one who's also head over heels affectionately in love with the people that are in need. You see, God is looking for people that he can work through to meet the needs of the people that he loves. And we are included in those people. Okay? But I want us to pray for our ministry because I truly believe that God is inviting us into a new season where we begin to shift our perspective and we begin to look at ourselves less and less, and we begin to look at others in need more and more. And instead of saying, well, I don't have much and there's not a lot I can do about that, we say, God, you've got it all. I'm willing. Will you give us what we need so I can go and meet this need? So I mean, that really is what ministry is all about, is to tend to and meet the needs of people, but we need to use God's resources. All right? Can we stand? And we're just going to begin to ask God right now. I believe God has already given the invitation. He's waiting to see if we're ready to hear, and he's waiting to see how we'll respond. And I want to respond, and I want to invite you to respond, to actively ask him to help us minister into the community, to partner with him in this new season. Where can I paint this picture? I can't picture anything that would be more fun than, for lack of a better term, an explosion of God things happening in the lives of people in the community. That honestly is not all going to, if any, or very little, happen in this room on a Sunday morning. But if the people of God will partner with God and his resources and go be the people of God the rest of the week and be ready to listen, be ready to follow. Remember, we prayed that a couple of weeks ago. Here I am, Lord, send me. And I believe God is just inviting us. And so can we just pray that together right now? You can pray silently or quietly under your breath, but let's just begin to ask God right now. Father, you're so good. And Jesus, we're asking you to come because we don't have within ourselves everything that we need to do the task that you've asked us to do. But we know that you're good. We know that you own everything. And Jesus, I'm asking, first of all, would you give us your heart? I think it would be good if we had a heart for your city, for your people, for your communities. And Jesus, I recognize that in asking for that, we might feel some brokenness. Because Jesus, I know that as you look and see the lost and lonely condition of many people, your heart breaks. And Jesus, I'm asking not more than we can take, but maybe would you even just break our hearts a little bit? Would you let us feel your compassion for people? And then, Jesus, as you do that, we're asking, just like you modeled and demonstrated, would you help us and allow us to use that brokenhearted condition to move us to action? That compassion would put its work boots on and go begin meeting needs. God, we ask that you would help us share resources. that you'd lead us, that you'd give us opportunities, and you'd give us ears to hear. Jesus, would you give us greater inroads to minister into the community? Not for our sake. Honestly, Jesus, we hope to serve you until the day we die and be forgotten. But if we can meet needs in the process, your legacy will continue. May we be known not as those people that were nice and kind and helped out. May we be known as the good news God people. That when those people come to town, things change. Needs are met. Lives are healed. We're asking, Lord, in simple terms for a harvest. And you've told us that it's plentiful, but the workers are few. Would you help us step up and become your workers? Would you meet us right now, even in this moment, even as we worship you through music? Would you speak to us? Would you meet us? And for some of us, if we need it, would you show us our own broken condition and remind us once again how good you are, that you saw us in the condition we were in and you saw fit to raise us up to new life. Come, Holy Spirit. Come, Holy Spirit.